Good evening. This is Professor Aminah Al-Din with Critical Talk from Muslim Network TV. This evening, we're going to explore how we explain what's going on with Israel and Palestine. Lots of news. Sometimes you can tell that it's biased news, and we want to get to the heart of the matter. And in that endeavor, I have with me Rav Ezra Balser, who just taught me that Rav is the Hebrew for rabbi. So all the rabbis I know have now become Rav. And he is a campus rabbi from Metro Chicago Hillel. And it is a part of a wide network of college campuses which have an Hillel office, but also a space for Jewish students, but not just Jewish students, for all others who want to come in here. Along with him, I have Dr. Kamal Abu Shamsia, who is visiting us from Jerusalem by way of Fresno, California. And he has his credentials in Muslim Christian relations and established Ziyara, I think I'm pronouncing it right, spiritual Ziyara.
Ziyara.
Good, got it. So thank both of you for spending some part of your early evening with me. I think we need to hear, we kind of got from television the political point of view. And I don't know all the time that the political point of view is that separable from the theological point of view. But both of you guys can give us an ethical theological perspective. And so, Rav Ezra, I'm going to go with you first. How do we view this from an ethical theological perspective in Judaism?
First, thanks for having me, Dr. Al-Din, and I hope very much that this is not like TV news. We have the opportunity to actually talk, and more importantly, listen to each other. So I think from the Jewish perspective, I think it's important to understand first who Jews are, in our own words, in our own understanding, that we are an ethno-religious people that originated in the land of Israel, that we have had a relationship to the land of Israel for 4,000 years. And it's our tradition in our Bible, in the Torah, that God actually promises us the land. Unfortunately, when the majority of Jews left the land after 70 CE, after the destruction of our second temple, it's important to know that we didn't leave by choice, that we were forced out. And even though the majority of us were forced out, there has always been a continuous presence of Jews living in the land of Israel. And throughout the following almost 2,000 years, it's in our tradition multiple times a day and at lots of different times of the year where we ask God and we pray to God to return to our home. At the end of every Passover Seder, we say next year in Jerusalem. And for lots of years we were saying that, and it's not theoretical for us. It was real. We have been hoping to come home. And in 1948, thankfully, we for the most part in our community believe that we had the opportunity to come home. And for the last 73 years have been trying to build that home and make it the home that we want it to be. So this is in our tradition, in a very special period of time for us, coming home after a very long period of time in exile.
Well, I think I'm going to give you a hot more minute because it's just not a nice exile. It's not that you're out there living and things are hunky-dory. So I think you need to add a sentence or two about that history.
Yeah, thank you. No, it was for the most part not a hunky-dory exile. I don't know that an exile can be all that great, but we were at most guests in a lot of different homes, throughout Europe and the Middle East and North Africa and India, Ethiopia, wherever the Jews have been, and for the most part, really seen at best as second-class citizens in a lot of those different societies and civilizations, and at worst hunted, persecuted, murdered. And so while we have dreamt of a home for our own purposes, to return to our own culture, to develop our own language, to be with each other and know what it's like to be the masters of our own destiny, we're also a people that has been persecuted and murdered, and we're afraid. We continue to be afraid to this day, where anti-Semitic attacks are happening all over the world. And we are thankful to God to have a refuge in the state of Israel. So in a lot of ways, it is a matter of Jewish safety. And it's also, I don't want to give up on the idea that really a lot of this is about fulfilling our dream to just come home.
Okay, Dr. Abu Shamsia, what is the history of Palestinians in the land?
Thank you so much, Dr. Aldine. The history of Palestinians, and that's, I look at it first from a Muslim perspective, look at it from a Jewish perspective, look at it from a Christian perspective, is as monotheistic religions. We date back to Abraham, the patriarch. So this is even predated Judaism, looking at the land that was shared by the descendants of Abraham. Abraham, peace be upon him, buried in the hometown where my parents came from, Al-Khalil or Hebron. And this is a connection of people to the land, predated contemporary politics or political movements to creating nation states. We look at it as a religious connection to the land of people who have been there to respond to God's call to be in the land. For me, particular as a Muslim, it is the first direction of the prayer or qibla that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, prayed towards Jerusalem. It is the site of the night journey of the Prophet to meet with God and to receive the prophethood. It is the land where Prophet Jesus walked and preached. So there is a connection that is very sacred to the land. And more important to the land, it is the connection of the people who are currently living there, been there before the creation of the state of Israel into the land and continue to live there. You only ask about the ethics of it. The ethics of the creation of the state of Israel resulted in a catastrophe on the people, the inhabitants who lived in Palestine, that created the worldwide crisis of refugees. People were evicted out of their homes, dispersed into neighboring countries and outside, and placed under brutal military occupation from 1947 until 1966, when it comes to, or the mid-60s, to the Palestinians who are currently living in Israel. And then from 1967 up till today, the rest of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem remains under brutal, I would say racist, colonial occupation that is depriving people of the basic human rights.
Okay. Well, seems to me like you all are of the same stock. So I don't know how racism gets in there, but I'll work with that later. We have two peoples, both Semitic, speaking kind of neighboring languages. And I was chuckling to myself because I worked very closely for a while with the Lubavitch community. So I kind of bristle when a Rav calls the Torah the Bible, but I'll get over it for the purposes of this meeting, Rav Ezra. So I have an ultra conservative point of view of Judaism. But I see and what I hear is one group where the scripture says that God gave them a land. They get run out of the land and wind up in a worldwide kind of exile for 2 millennia. On the other hand, people live in the land and are claiming a kind of religious heritage, not necessarily to the land, but a kind of diverse group of people, perhaps who have come to live in the land. The Christians, I can't speak for the Jews there because they had to have been part of another history, but the Christians and the Muslims who come there are claiming a kind of, we've been here, and with a claim to Abraham. So while I don't want to go into the history of the wars, because my show is not long enough, there have been a number of serious wars fought. From my limited knowledge, Israel won the war. So I'm now going to say, in winning that war, what additions, what special circumstances were given to Christian and Muslim Palestinians, Rav Ezra, who are living on the land? That I don't know.
Well, first, I want to reiterate that Jews were always living in the land, especially in Jerusalem and in Tzfat. There have been continuous presence. I think through one lens, yes, Israel won the war, and through another lens, the war hasn't ended.
It's a long war.
I agree, and from our perspective, the war for the acceptance of our ability to come home is still being waged, and that is still going on to this day. And so there, of course, are other people who are living there and who were living there. And our hope is to be able to honor those homes as well as honor our home. And I think that's the meaningful way forward, is for us both to admit that we have a shared home and try to figure out a way to accept that from each other.
Your comment, Dr. Kamal.
That has not been happening.
True.
People are denied the basics of human decency, the basics right of movement, the basic right of access to religious sites, both Christians and Muslims, the basic rights of cultivating the land that they live on it, living in a home or even building a home. And when they build a home, that home eventually is destroyed, or they're evicted out of it to bring about people without connection to the land, who are born outside of the land for events politically that are difficult, as you mentioned, in the history of what happened to Jews in Europe or other places, of example of what you mentioned of anti-Semitism, that came on the expense of the local population, who have nothing to do with anti-Semitism or what happened to Jews in Europe and elsewhere. Combined to that, we have the political atmosphere of conflating the Jewish connection to the land with political Zionism, which the two are not synonymous. And we look at these movements of looking at Christian Zionists, look at the Zionist movement itself, that reinterprets the scriptures to advance one view over another, to deny basic rights of Muslims and Christians at the expense of having a meaningful life, having the freedom, the basic decency of treatment. So that is counter to the ethics and to the justice of Judaism, of a faith that I studied, and from the people that I came across to talk to, who are Jews who simply do not agree with the politics of the State of Israel. And here I would like to differentiate that criticism of the State of Israel and its occupation is not anti-Semitism. This is a political debate. As a matter of fact, Israeli citizens who are Jews are more critical to the government than the Palestinians, and they're not being labeled anti-Semitism. And at the same time, Jews who take a stand for justice and criticize the policies of the State of Israel should not be labeled as anti-Semite as well. So support for Palestine is not an anti-Semite, and criticizing the State of Israel and its occupation does not amount to anti-Semitism as well.
Well, with all due respect, I think Jews get to define what Judaism is and what anti-Semitism is for ourselves. And I would hope that every oppressed people and every minority gets that opportunity as well. To over 90% of Jews worldwide, Israel and Zionism continues to be an important part, a core part of their Jewish identity. Zionism is simply our national liberation movement that seeks to return us to our homeland and have a state in some part of our ancestral homeland.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. Criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. I do it all the time. And you're right. Open the Israeli newspaper, it happens all the time. But the refusal, the rejection of our right to exist as a nation state is a rejection of our liberation movement of saying we have to go back to not being the masters of our own destiny, to being a traveling people subject to other people's whims. We do see that as an unfair and illegitimate attack that is anti-Semitic.
Let me respond to that. And when it comes to the Palestinians, when they signed the peace accords, they recognized the state. So that right of being there to say denied that does not exist. Palestinians did recognize the state of Israel. What Palestinians object to is to have a precondition to establishing the state of Palestine to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Israel can define itself any way it wants. That's not an issue for the Palestinians, as you mentioned. If you have the right to define anti-Semitism, you have the right to define what your state is, not to demand as part of the negotiations that each Palestinian should acknowledge the Jewishness of the state. The main issue with that Jewishness of the state, the way the Zionist movement see it, is you have 20% of Israel population today are Muslims and Christians who are still being denied the basic rights or looked upon as second citizens and living under inequality as citizens of the state of Israel, who are revolting today against the state of Israel and who've been arrested today. So this issue of freedom for all is not on the ground translated into policies. And that's what I have an issue with.
Okay, both gentlemen, you know I am learning so much. I got my pencil out, taking notes on the side here. We're going to take a minute or two break, get your thoughts together. You all are too calm for me. Everything is jumping off, and you all are just laid back and just giving. I want to commend both of you for giving us some facts that we can move forward with. We'll be back in a few minutes. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Din with Critical Talk for Muslim Network TV. We'll be right back.
Billboards are popping up all over the country with an...
Our neighbors don't realize that Muslims are absolutely opposed to ISIS.
Salam. My name is Abdul Malik Mujahid. I'm an imam in Chicago.
16 shots! No me! No justice! No me!
So how do we bring up the energy which can really have an impact on the world? You need to build bridges of understanding among people, and we need to have America moving forward. That lesson learned have brought the strength of humanity to America, which is the diversity.
Mujahid Talks, only on Muslim Network TV. Faithfully connected.
We are back. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Din, and I am having a very rational conversation with two men who function as chaplains and who are giving us many of the nuts and bolts. I'm sure they'll give us some more. Rev Ezra and Dr. Kamal. I am curious, and there's stuff in what both of you have said that I still want to push you on. If I skip Israel-Palestine for a minute, let's go to Chicago. If I am the major, I don't know, social political network in Chicago, and I've been that way for a long time, or recent, it doesn't matter. And I've set up some things I'm going to tolerate and some other things I'm not going to tolerate. And I got a group of Black people living on the south side of Chicago who decide I'm being denied, as what happened during the pandemic, my basic rights, etc. Where is the line between me demanding those rights and trying to force you to give them, and me holding a line saying you're not going to turn my city upside down? Am I making any sense? Because that's kind of what I heard. If as Rev Ezra says, it's an ongoing war, which is, I think, beat out the war with Afghanistan. If it's an ongoing war, and I have to suspect that the motivations of some of the folks coming off the South Side are not good, and they're going to wreak havoc and cause destruction and perhaps loss of life, how do I contain that? On the other hand, if you're saying that I'm being denied basic rights, etc., then how do I push to get those in a way such that we don't wind up where we are today? Either one of you, both of, not at the same time, but either one of you. Rav Ezra, go.
Well, first, I think for the most part, the majority of people just want to be able to live their lives and be with their families,
yes,
and worship and keep the traditions that they hold dear to them. And as it comes to minorities in Israel, much like a lot of countries, there are problems. And the 20% of the non-Jewish population of Israel, you're right, it's not the best situation. I think it was probably, considering the region, a lot better than a lot of other countries are doing towards their minorities. Mm-hmm. And still lots of work to go. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to assume nefarious, intentions on behalf of people that are in tough situations. We're born into unsettling or unfair situations. I think it's on us as a democracy to make those changes. Of course, those 20% of the non-Jewish population of Israel have representation in parliament, in Knesset, where we may see in the coming week or weeks some unprecedented history of Arab and Muslim parties being part of the governing coalition. We might not, but it's certainly being pushed to the forefront of the conversation in ways it had never been accepted in the past, and I think that's a good thing.
I don't think people know that.
I think, there's a lot of intricacies to how the government of Israel is set up and works. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, the fact that there has been a placeholder government for 2.5 years is one way to look at it, that it's not so great. On the other hand, I think minorities have a strong say in how government is put together, both within intra-Jewishly, from different segments of the Jewish population, and hopefully, and rightfully so, the Arab population as well. we were hoping, at least my segment of the Jewish world, we're hoping that comes out, and that they get all the rights that they absolutely deserve, and that are promised to them in the Declaration of Israel's independence.
Okay, Dr. Kamal.
Well, first of all, I would like to commend you, Ezra, on calling for sharing of the land. That is among the first time that I hear it from Jewish and probably Zionists as well. If so, the right of return for those who are evicted out of their home has never been given back to the people who used to live in the same neighborhood that still exists today. Their homes are taken by Jews, taken into state land, and they are not allowed or denied the right of return to their homes. The second, when we talk about the framework of what's happening inside of Israel itself, it is completely different than the framework of Israel governing the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. The West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem is an occupied territories. Israel is the occupier and the Palestinians are the occupied. So when we look at how can we protect the measures of humanity to the people there, I don't look at the goodwill of Israel. Israel is the occupier. It's like, how can you protect the rights of Black people from police brutality if you treat them nice? That is not. It's a brutal police force that needs to be reformed. So when I look at the Fourth Geneva Convention, I look at the United Nations declarations that protect the right of the occupied people under occupation. So it is not the goodwill of Israel to provide the basic needs of the Palestinians. It must offer that based on declarations of human rights and United Nations resolutions. The problem is it has not been respected. The Fourth Geneva Convention that guaranteed the safety and the security of those occupied in Palestine have been completely denied. However, to this week, the announcement by President Biden was a significant shift in the way the US has been looking at Israel because of those violations of human rights. For the first time, we hear a sitting president who says Israelis, actually he said the Palestinians and the Israelis have equally deserve the safety, the security, equals measures of freedom, prosperity, and democracy. And I'm yet to see what does that mean from a US policy perspective, how Israel is going to respond to that. Our Secretary of State repeated that statement today as he's visiting Palestine and Israel. So the issue is not left up to Israel to provide to respect the decency and the dignity of the people it occupies. There are international agreements that bound Israel, and when it's not doing that, the Palestinians have the right to look at Israel and say what's happened in South Africa is happening today. And actually, it is becoming even worse than South Africa, and a matter of apartheid policies. There is one set for Jews and one set for the local populations. Those are what we look at, not inside of Israel. Inside of Israel, there is inequality. Arabs who are citizens of Israel have some rights. They can vote, they have citizenship, they have access to education, even though the budgets are not equal. Jews have different budget than Arabs, but I'm talking about Palestinians who are under occupation in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. That is the context of the ongoing tension and war, which from 1967 until the mid-80s has been mainly nonviolent movement, which was crushed.
Well, let me interrupt you, Dr. Kamal. I haven't seen anything nonviolent over there. But let me give Rav Ezra an opportunity to respond to some of this, or all of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the differences are many between us, between Israel and apartheid South Africa. And for example, I think we do not govern who can have relations with each other, or what races or what ethnicities can mix. or who can have what jobs. I think the military governance of the West Bank is an unfortunate and sad current reality. And I think from the Israeli perspective, it stops violence. That Israel has the right to defend itself against attacks targeting civilians, and following many rejections of peace offers to have that land governed by the Palestinians. This is the status quo that keeps Israelis the most safe. There are, of course, autonomous areas that are governed by the Palestinian Authority today. I don't think very few people would admit that the status quo is a good situation or the ideal situation, and I'm one of those people. And I think it is a complex reality for which it continues for one reason, is because it works. It's an unfortunate and sad reality, but it keeps Israelis safe from suicide bombs, from attacks on pizza parlors and buses.
An interesting kind of scenario. I want to, in this meeting, is it's not because I'm running for negotiator of the year, guys, but I think it behooves us to stay away from pejorative analogies. Israel is not South Africa. I think South Africa is very unique in and of its own negative rate. What is happening in Israel-Palestine is very sad in some sense, horrific in other senses. But I'm just wondering, because I hear about these tentative agreements, and many Americans have heard about them, two-state solutions, this, that, and the other. And I'm not too sure how any of those solutions would be viable. If you have one state totally dependent for its livelihood on another state, I don't know if sovereignty is intact. If that's not a solution, then what are the possibilities for a solution? Equity is essential in the modern world. And I wanted to ask Rav Ezra, does Israel consider itself a Republican democracy, a capitalistic democracy? What kind of democracy does Israel consider itself?
I believe it considers itself to be a representative democracy. There are 120 seats in the Knesset, which reflects back to our history of the men of the ancient Knesset, and parties. It's a slate democracy. I mean, parties are voted upon, and based on their percentages, they're divvied up seats in the parliament, and the party who can get to the party that has the most votes at the end of an election usually is tasked with the mandate of forming a government. And if they can cobble together at least 61 seats, they are the leader of the party who was tasked with the mandate becomes the prime minister.
Oh, okay. It's one of the solutions people are talking about what's happening, for the United States, because we also have some issues with representative government. In that now we have folk moving to try to squash the voting rights of folk, So, I mean, I think those things move around. I'm trying to get a map of the region that we're speaking of, because oftentimes, you all know it like the back of your hand, but my listening audience has no clue, it's a slip of land, but where is it again now, kind of stuff. So I wanted them to be able to follow, because Dr. Kamal mentioned that there are Arabs living inside of Jerusalem who have voting rights. I'm assuming kids can go to school, those Arabs can work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Are there any problems there?
If we are to mention the population who live between what's the Mediterranean and the River Jordan, that includes Israel and the West Bank. We look at
Blow that up a little bit. The map. I'm sorry. Go ahead. 'Cause
we
I
look
can't-
at people who are inside of Israel, as Rabbi Ezra mentioned, do have the voting rights. People who are in Jerusalem are occupied. They don't have voting rights. They do enjoy some rights as residents of Jerusalem. People in the West Bank and Gaza have no rights whatsoever. So when we look at a democracy that does not include
Okay. You
of
mean when you
people-
say they have no rights whatsoever, you mean they have no rights inside of
there is no
Israel?
representation. There is no representation. They are ruled by a military government that basically dictates every single part of their lives, when to leave their home and when they can't leave their home to be placed under round-the-clock curfew, when they have rights to be in their home, when they can be evicted out of their home. So that's one part. The second part is the ongoing land confiscation within the West Bank that's supposed to be the future state of Palestine, that is separating the Palestinian population from each other. It's not continuous piece of land, separated by freeways that are for Jews only. Palestinians are not allowed to be on those freeways, and bypass roads that took most of the fertile land, the agricultural land of Palestine, for the creation of settlements. So the ongoing offers that we continue to hear do not amount to 12% of Palestine, something that no one would be able to accept. It's not a viable solution. If the issue becomes non-viable, there will not be any peace. There will be no sharing of the land. There will be no democracy, and there'll be definitely a continuous fuel for violence for generations to come.
Your response, Rav Ezra.
I would just say that it depends what you're calling Palestine. If you were talking about the West Bank, then I believe in 2007, 97% of it was offered, including East Jerusalem as a capital. So that is a different math than I think what we just heard. It always depends on
by who to who?
By Ehud Olmert, former Prime Minister of Israel.
Okay.
It excluded all the settlements. It excluded what Israel took as security buffer in the.
He did
So this offer.
He did not interrupt you. Let me let him finish, and I will get right back to you.
That's fine. I think go ahead. It's fine. I was done.
So we have, where is East Jerusalem? What am I seeing here? I see the West Bank. You all follow me on this map. I see the West Bank. I see Jerusalem. I see Bethlehem. I see, well, that can't be what I'm thinking it is. Beersheba, Ramallah. No, it's not. That's something else.
It'd probably be the eastern half of the dot that says Jerusalem, would be my guess.
Okay. And so what was offered now?
So what was offered, and you can correct me, Rav, we're not talking anything about the yellow thing on the map. We're talking about 70 or even less % of the blue thing that is outside of Jerusalem, taking out of that most of the fertile land that is to the east of the Jordan Valley or the west of the Jordan Valley, between the West Bank and Jordan, that remain under security or land that will be kept within Israel. Take out of that map the zillion of settlements who are already established, along with that the roads that cut the West Bank. So what we left with is a Swiss cheese. So that's not a generous offer, considering that United Nations Resolution 242 asked Israel to withdraw from all the land that was occupied in 1967.
Wait a minute. Asked Israel to withdraw from what?
From all the land that it occupied in 1967.
Wait a minute. Hold tight. Who won the war in 1967?
Israel won the war.
Okay. Now, in the winning of the war, what land did they win with winning that war?
They won the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip.
In addition to what I'm seeing in yellow?
What you see in yellow was won in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. So there were two wars where historical Palestine was divided. The first time in 1948, and there was a ceasefire, and in 1967, that took the rest of the historical Palestine.
So the UN.
I'll just add that the Golan Heights and the Sinai Desert were also captured, and the Sinai Desert was given in exchange for peace with Egypt, something we continue to hope to be able to do in our long-term mantra of land for peace. I do think that what I believe to be about 97% of the West Bank that was offered, with land swaps to make up for the percentages that don't get included because of long-standing Jewish living in what it basically amounts to suburbs of Jerusalem, that we're just not going to be left out. So I think that is the offer that Israel made in 2007, which most Israelis believe was a fair offer.
Okay.
Allow me to interject. Allow me to interject on the territorial swap. The territorial swap meant to empty what is today Israel from its Arab population, evict them out of their lands and homes, to basically have the Jewish state that Ezra mentioned that they have a dream to have. So the Arabs who are living now inside of Israel, their ancestors were kicked once, and now they are going to be kicked twice from their homes to make room for this dream of Jewish-only state. The Palestinians did not agree to that eviction of their brethren from what is today Israel. They continue to ask for the resolution 242 that basically calls on Israel to withdraw from all of the land that it occupied in 1967.
So I want to get to one more thing, but I have to say I remain confused. My understanding of world history is that you have a war. Somebody wins the war, somebody loses the war. If the people that lost the war are going to demand everything they lost back, that's a little interesting. I don't quite get it. I mean, I will, and I don't understand all the resolutions, but I want to get to the questions, to the question of settlers. I don't know who they are. Are they Orthodox Jews? Are they conservative Jews? Are they Jews from different areas around the world who want to come and settle in Israel? Rav Ezra, who are they?
Well, settlers, I think, are Jews. And I think they generally come in two different ways. One is ideological settlers, who are there to liberate, in their words, the land of Israel. What we would be referring to as the West Bank has for thousands of years been referred to in our tradition as Judea and Samaria. Hebron, which is one of our holiest cities. It's a shared holy city. That's I mean, Judea is literally where we get the term Jews from. We have 4,000 years of history in that area. And so there are ideological settlers who want to redeem and liberate that land and bring it back to full Jewish control. And that is why they are establishing settlements in those areas. And then there are what we call sort of financial settlers or quality of life settlers that the government has offered certain areas of land to build that are just simply cheaper than living in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or other places. And so some people take that deal on a financial level, but they are sort of all different kinds of religiosities and all different kinds of motivations.
Now, are they settling on top of Palestinians?
What do you mean?
Oh, I don't know. We just had
Of course they are.
a case here where in Chicago, the newest thing is homeless people are finding homes that are unoccupied, not totally, but the
Right.
owners go out for the day and they come back and somebody else is living there.
So I think it depends on where we're talking. I think
Okay.
if we're talking about Gush Etzion, the Etzion block, that's places Jews have lived for a long time, and that's one thing. If we're talking about outside Hebron, I think that's sort of a hot button area where yes, there are settlers coming in and taking real estate, and it's making it difficult for local Palestinians. An understatement, I'm sure, to live their lives. So I think it is depends on where we're talking.
What are you talking about? Okay.
The settlement issue, number one, is a colonialist project that is aimed to empty the people out of their homes and their land. The second one, it is illegal under international law and therefore the Geneva Convention for the occupying power to bring its own population into the occupied territories. So no matter how you look at it, it is displacement of the original inhabitants of the land and bringing them with people to push for a political agenda. That continues to be a sticking point, and that continues to be a major obstacle to achieving a viable Palestinian state and eventually kills the two-state solution.
Well, needless to say, in my 50 minutes, I have learned a lot. I see some of the sticking points perhaps from a different position, but as men who work with inside of your own faith and with people from other faiths, what in a minute for each do you see as a potential way, at least to beginning a conversation, other than bringing me on and having me negotiate?
I would say the first thing is we have in our respective faiths a great foundation for respect of human decency and the human life and the worthiness of the human life. This is a great foundation to attach ourselves with. The foundation of justice, this is a great foundation to attach ourselves with. And for people here in the United States, that to be committed not to bring the violence of the Middle East into our own communities. With this, I'll take the opportunity to condemn all form of hatred, from Islamophobia to anti-Semitism. This cannot be tolerated. Our political issues and conflict can be dealt with. We have room for disagreement, but when it comes to the basic rights and decency and freedom and respect, we should always join hand in hand.
Rav Ezra.
First, I just want to thank both of you for having this conversation with me. I think one of the ways forward is to continue to have these conversations. I don't know if we can contract you, Dr. Aldine, for all of such future conversations, but there's a lot of yelling and posturing and finger pointing that goes on in our lives, in our communities, on TV, in the newspapers. And the more we have opportunities to hear from each other, to explain our perspectives, to talk about our pain and to listen to the pain of others, that is a huge step forward. I think, we're seeing, again, like I said earlier, a huge spike, an almost 500% rise in anti-Semitic attacks across the world in the last few weeks. And I appreciate all of the sentiments that are for us to stand against hate and violence. And it's tough. It's scary to be a Jew right now. And I think the way forward in this larger conversation is the acceptance of history and reality, that This is a land that has been made home to at least two peoples.
Yeah.
And when we accept that, and that we're not going anywhere, nobody's going anywhere, and that we shouldn't have to ask the other to leave either, we're not going to. When we accept that this is our home and that this is your home, I think the way forward is actually not that far away.
Oh, I'm loving this. You know, this is the most rational discussion I've heard, even though we didn't get to go deep into some issues. You all didn't fight with each other. I didn't have to exert my womanness to shut you up. I mean, this has been really, really informative. And I can't tell both of you how much I appreciate your being willing to come on this show. And I might pursue this again a little bit further because this issue has a lot to say for other similar issues. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, how people, especially with some chaplains leading the way, how people begin to see outside of their own bubble. You know, make a little space, just a little pinch to see outside of their own bubble, to see inside of someone else's bubble. As you, Rav Ezra, talked about, the ability to listen is just an awesome one. And again, I can't thank you enough. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Din on Critical Talk for Muslim Network TV. And I have had the honor and the pleasure of being with Rav Ezra Balser and Dr. Kamal Abu Shamsia. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Hopefully one day by us, you can both come for Shabbat dinner. My wife would love to, and I would love to have you both over.
She cooking? She cooking?
We're both cooking, but yeah.
All right. Anytime. Thank you.